Started. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Erica Mixon. I'm the content marketing manager at Blumira. We're joined by Scott Nelson, who is a director of cybersecurity with Cerium Networks. Cerium is actually a partner of ours. We're so excited to have Scott join today. So thank you so much, Scott. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into cybersecurity?
Yes, and it has nothing to do with a trout in my hands. I have been in the IT space for 30 odd years. When I spent 15 years at Cisco Systems, I was the first cybersecurity specialist for small and medium customers on the West Coast, really helping amplify that product portfolio, and then really just fell in love with the opportunity to help fight this fight. Right? I mean, it's not necessarily the brightest day some days. You're dealing with some dark actors, but ultimately, it is one our customers are really struggling with. So rather than just going out and pitching switches and routers, I pivoted into cybersecurity and then have moved over to Cerium, which is one of our Cisco's larger partners, to really help amplify Cerium's cybersecurity practice, where we provide technical controls, advisory services, and managed services. And when Blumira approached us, it really filled both a product line gap, but more importantly, a customer gap that we saw. So super excited to work with you and be available to talk today.
Awesome. Yeah, we're excited to have you join. And then we've also got Matt Warner, who's the CTO and co-founder of Blumira. I'm sure if you've watched any of our live streams before, you may have seen Matt's face at one time or another. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us once again. We really appreciate your insight as always.
Happy to be here.
Excellent.
Excited to be here. Any positive words in there?
I hear you. So today we're going to be talking about how small to medium businesses can defend themselves against ransomware. And it seems like ransomware has just been, in the news constantly for the past 6 months to a year. It just seems like ransomware is all anyone is ever talking about. And what I've noticed is it seems like the larger enterprises are always kind of front and center when it comes to those headlines. We've got Colonial Pipeline, Accenture, all of those ransomware attacks that have had a large impact on a big company, but you don't necessarily hear about the smaller even medium-sized businesses that get attacked with ransomware on a daily basis. And why do you think that is? Either Scott or Matt, feel free to join in here. Obviously the news outlets are trying to scare people a little bit as to, what could happen when a ransomware attack occurs. But what's the reality for the IT teams in these smaller or medium-sized businesses that might get hit with a ransomware attack?
I'll offer what I've seen, and that is that, what is newsworthy versus what is happening are two different things. Mm-hmm. I have seen ransomware events at companies that just wouldn't register on anyone's radar. There is certainly newsworthiness that if the food chain has been impacted or the fuel supply chain has been impacted, that's newsworthy for everyone, and you'll see it on the mainstream news. But I've had companies less than 500 employees be popped with a $700,000 ransomware request. And what I'm seeing without question is that the price point has gone up. There used to be a day it was 5,000, 10,000. That picture of me is around a fly fishing lodge that I'm associated. They got hit with it. It was $2,500 to get out of the ransom. That's not the case anymore. And then what we're seeing in parallel is that when people start going back to their cyber insurers, they're finding that they are either not even insurable because the controls aren't correct, or the prices have gone up so high that this original thesis of, well, I don't need to care because I've got cyber insurance, that logic is gone. Mm-hmm. It doesn't follow anymore. So Matt, I don't know if you have other observations.
Yeah, it's very similar to what we're seeing in the SMB space, where historically you might be able to avoid a really impactful ransomware event just because techniques weren't as advanced a number of years ago, or the bounties were much less back then, or really number of years ago, there weren't as many situations where you're going to be blackmailed for your data. There you go, extortion, all that good stuff associated with your data. And these days, you have so many issues associated with exfiltration, extortion of that data, the bounty going up. And those situations create kind of a perfect storm for SMBs where you almost have to get to the point where you must get these controls in place. You must get things under control within your environment, or you're going to run into a situation where you have to sit down one day and go, well, everything's encrypted and they took all of our data. What do we do now? And that's not a conversation that really anyone wants to have. You're better off having the conversation of they encrypted all of our data, but they'll want us some money. That is a good conversation instead of a, well, they have our data as well. And if you don't have visibility into that data, you don't have a way to determine what your controls are, then cyber insurance, just as Scott said, is almost an impossible thing at this point, just because they expect you to try to have those controls in place as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Scott, with Cerium being an MSP, you're obviously dealing with a lot of small and medium-sized businesses as clients every day. What are some of the most major challenges or obstacles that you're seeing where your clients aren't able to have those proper controls in place or feel like they're secure enough against ransomware attacks?
I think that this slide talks to a lot of them, right? I mean, these are normally not large teams. These are individuals who are hardworking, well-intentioned, and wearing many hats. So their cyber experiences are limited. They then have often inherited toolkits that were bought by predecessors that they didn't really make the decision. They didn't know the interface. And in some cases, they don't even have the technical acumen to really go out and evaluate what is best of X. And I jokingly call them Franken networks. But ultimately, by having all these different products from all these different vendors, some that I knew, some that I don't, combined with my responsibilities for keeping the voice system up and the data center running, there's too many alerts for them to respond to understand. And candidly, when I talked about why did Cerium partner with Blumira, it's because that SMB space in particular did not have access to a tool like Blumira, and the way that Blumira is democratizing access to threat defense and response is really a game changer for them and a value add that we can provide our customers.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that explanation there. That's kind of where our sweet spot is catering to those smaller IT and security teams and being able to prevent alert fatigue and really prioritizing those alerts so people can focus on what matters rather than get inundated constantly, which is just leading to not, looking at the alerts at all, which then is a whole other concern. So yeah, well, thank you for that explanation. It seems like they're like Matt was saying earlier, it's kind of like a perfect storm of all these different factors and circumstances that smaller IT teams and security teams are faced with.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, it's a situation that not only has the advancement of red team and attacking tools significantly improve the ability for all of these stages to be easier for attackers, but it's also made it harder for defenders and SMBs and anyone to actually properly stop, identify, and be able to properly mitigate inside of these stages. So it becomes really, really important to understand how are these attacks taking place? How can they take place within your environment? And how is your environment built to either defend against these attacks or at the very least get visibility into these attacks? Because if you can be sure after a ransomware attack that stage 5 did not happen, that there was no exfiltration of data, at the very least, you know that they can't extort you for your data, which is worth a lot in the grand scheme of all. If you have backups and you know you can recover and you know someone didn't exfiltrate your data, then you don't need to worry as much about how those people are approaching your environment. Whereas if you have no visibility and you can't identify that stage 5, it's a dangerous, dangerous game to be in for you and your organization, just generally speaking.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And what I've learned from you, Matt, is that it's so important to really focus on the stages of an attack, of a ransomware attack, and recognize those behaviors so that you can understand when malicious behavior is going on in your environment. Do you want to talk through really at a high level
Sure.
what those stages of attack are and how Blumira helps you respond to those behaviors?
Sure, yeah. So generally speaking, ransomware these days and the tactics, techniques, and procedures associated with them are going to follow what we would have called APT attacks 3 years ago in a lot of cases. There are still those like classic just access brokers that are going to determine if there's access, sell the access to someone else, and they're going to drop ransomware on your account. But in either case, all that really shows that there's a really advanced market and a really advanced just set of tools around ransomware attacking. So when we talk about discovery and we talk about gaining foothold, we're talking about techniques that are going to be really similar to what you would expect to see in a really good pen test and advanced phishing, spear phishing kind of campaigns against environments, or really testing the boundaries of your network to determine where there is access into your network. So any sort of VPNs, any sort of remote access into your environment, like RDP is a good example of that. And then phishing, allowing macros, all the classic kind of access patterns you're still going to see from ransomware because they still work. It still works to drop macros. It still works to find a VPN that someone forgot to turn on MFA for an account on. All of these techniques are really common. And for those of you who've been watching the CVEs coming out of VPNs, a lot of VPNs over the last few years have 0 days that allow pre-auth RCs or remote code execution against them. And then you don't need to do anything. You can just the attacker can do whatever they want so long as you are not staying updated on those patches. Or if you use SonicWall, like a lot of people, a lot of those old SonicWalls are end of life now and are just stuck on the internet vulnerable. And those all become that discovery, gaining foothold component to your environment. One of the areas that we really find interesting is the gain foothold, escalate privileges, and execute files. So execution within your environment. It requires someone to touch your environment. It requires someone to get in there. They're going to execute something. It might be in memory. It'll vary depending on what they're doing. It could be entirely based off of things that exist in your environment. If someone accesses your environment through VPN with known credentials, they could encrypt your entire environment without dropping a piece of malware. They could just use BitLocker, take the keys with them, drop a note and say, have fun trying to pull this apart. You owe us money now. And in those situations, you really need visibility from two different perspectives. You need it from the perspective of malware in your environment. What kind of new files, what kind of threats are being introduced to your environment? And you also need it from the perspective of how existing, what on the attacker side they're going to call living off the land, what binaries are being used in your environment. How is PowerShell being used? Is it being used to execute or drop any sort of applications? Are people using base64 decoding inside of it? There are patterns that must occur for these attacks to land. And those are the patterns that as Scott was saying, that Blumira looks for across ransomware environments. So we push really heavily on Sysmon, for example, because we can look at essentially every single process execution. And if you've looked at any ransomware news recently, you've seen as you get into stage 4 and 5, their execute files and exfiltrate data, they're going to drop rclone. They're going to use rclone to pull all that data up into Mega or something like Mega at that point. And even just being able to look at all process execution, see that rclone has been dropped and executed is going to tell you, hey, this is happening. You need to stop this right now, because if you don't, it's going to get encrypted after they're done with the step. So ensuring that you have broad visibility from discovery, so how they're looking for entrance, gain that foothold, how they're actually going to move into it. It could be executing phishing, it could be RDP, it could be VPN, how they're going to escalate privileges, which 3 months ago, I think all of us would have been like, hey, this is hard sometimes and they won't figure this out. But with Print Nightmare and all the other issues that have come out recently, it is not hard to escalate privileges inside of a Windows machine anymore. It is insanely easy now, actually. And for those of you who didn't see, the patch that came out this week for Print Nightmare did not actually fix the exploit issue. So it's still happening. Executing files, of course, if you have EDR or any other endpoint, it's really important to see visibility across all of your environment, not just one place, but anywhere in your environment that these kind of executions can happen. Network data for exfiltrate, determining what's happening in the environment, and of course, deploying ransomware requires them to execute things. PS exec is the most common thing we're going to see for pushing those commands across the environment. If you use PS exec, great. If you don't, you should detect every single instance of PS exec in your environment. It will make your life way, way easier for detecting these threats as well. That was very long-winded, I apologize.
No, that was a great explanation. I really appreciate that. And it's good to get the high level view of, from discovery to deploying ransomware, how an attacker moves through your environment. I think that it's also great for us to give tangible advice, which is what we're about to do. Give 5 tangible things that you can do right now to defend your organization against ransomware. And they're all really reasonable things for a smaller IT and security team to do. Would you say that's right, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm excited to talk about them. I think on this one slide, and I want to be sensitive to time, what's interesting to me, everything Matt said was true and powerful.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at how the technical controls my SMB customers would have to deploy to achieve protections here, there's tools there, but almost every single one of those steps, those stages, is a different product with a different management domain.
Yes.
And again, that goes back to, okay, if you are in fact able to provide the technical controls, can you actually run them? Can you interpret them? And I think that is such a powerful differentiator for Blumira.
Yeah, absolutely. A great point. We provide access to a team of security experts that are essentially there for any question that you have, ways to remediate. So if there's a finding that comes through and you don't know how to interpret it, you just type it into the chat box, say, hey, what should I do here? And Blumira security expert will get back to you in a timely manner, giving you really in-depth advice as to how to interpret that and what you should do next. So that's another great point as well, Scott. So let's get into these best practices that we're about to talk about. Securing RDP. So RDP was the top intrusion vector for ransomware in 2020. Does that come as a surprise to either of you?
Not to me.
No, I purposely host RDP servers on the internet just to collect logs, and I get millions of login attempts a day. It is constant, and it's fun for me at least. I mean, it's not fun for them; they're wasting their cycles, but it's fun for me.
Well, it's good to have hobbies, Matt.
Exactly. Yes.
Scott, you were talking earlier about how you're trying to move away a lot of your clients to away from RDP. What are some alternatives that you recommend?
I mean, if you want to do something like a pure VDI infrastructure, that certainly is interesting. But what I've seen that has had a little bit more traction lately is what I lovingly call SSL VPN 2.0, and that may date me. We partner with Duo in our practice. I don't think maybe it's news to some of you, but a lot of the Blumira team came from Duo, so I don't think I'm saying a dirty word. But Duo has this thing called the DAG, and I can put just a web page up with the icons that represent the applications that user needs to have. And they click on it, they get a dual factor, and then we're able to handle that on the back end. It's much easier to maintain. It's much better from a user experience. When you start then, and we'll talk about VPN shortly, when you start combining that with direct connect to some of your cloud environments, it really is a superlative way to compute. So RDP is heavy-handed, it's old school. I mean, I'm a Mac user, and every so often in past lives, I've had to RDP into a Windows desktop, and it's just kludgy. So when you consider the user experience, and then you blend that with the threat of having RDP out there, and there's just no reason now, because there's better ways to communicate and connect.
Mm-hmm. Are there any reasons? It looks like the majority, I launched a poll about whether you use RDP. Looks like the majority of respondents do. What would be some reasons as to why you wouldn't want to switch over, if any?
There were periods of time where you use RDP to get into system level controls and not simply just getting into virtual desktops. However, again, now what we're seeing is with platforms like Duo, I'm actually able to put MFA all the way down to switch ports and to system levels and establish a trusted connection that way. Mm-hmm. So I also think, and I could be wrong, we all have our old tricks and we know them, we like them, and we defer to them. RDP's been around a long way, and it's been a tool that a lot of system administrators have used to connect to the back end of their networks. Um,
So let's say, you want to have RDP in your environment for one reason or another. What are some best practices to make sure that doesn't become a vector for ransomware?
you're going to really have to tighten down your firewall controls. You're definitely going to want MFA around that connection. But I'm just of a mindset that, don't make it internet facing. Use it through a management port only. But Matt, I don't know if you have other ideas on that.
Yeah, the biggest one that we see that doesn't get brought up a lot, but I do tend to recommend, although people don't necessarily love this, but I'm going to recommend it anyways, is to shut off cached logins for anything you RDP into. Because of the nature of how attacks work these days, the moment that an attacker drops in, and we know they're going to escalate because there's about 12 ways to do it natively in Windows right now, they're going to drop Mimikatz. They're going to dump out every cache login on that host. And what's really common, and it happens pretty much because by default, I think the cache is 50 logins, 20, 30 and 50, somewhere up there. By default, let's say that RDP server, you had one of your DAs RDP into a week ago, and there's still one of the cache logins on there. That attacker now has full access to your environment. It doesn't matter if they just had a random cred that they were able to RDP in with, or they were able to use password spraying and get in from the internet. If that server has been logged into by anyone with additional permissions, that is now going to be exposed for you. So I generally recommend any server that's using RDP should have cache logins disabled. If you look at our Petit Potom, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, we do discuss how to disable that in there because of the risks associated with it. So feel free to Google for that. It's probably one of the best ways to make your RDP servers more secure, because then even if someone is able to get into it, they won't be able to dump the creds from the cache login. The outstanding warning for that will of course be if your DC isn't available, you will not be able to log into that machine. It requires the DC to be available to RDP into it. So you need to be choosy about how you're approaching that. But of course, never over from the internet, I should say. And if possible, don't even put a server in a place where it could accidentally be exposed by an ACL change. We see that often, where someone will make an ACL change and all of a sudden we'll start seeing RDP traffic brute forcing a server that it didn't intend to be exposed. But as all of us know in the IT world, it is a pain to manage firewalls. It just is. And Scott made a great point earlier of you go into a network that you don't know and you're just responsible for, let's say, an ASA all of a sudden, and you were previously a FortiGate person, you're just like, oh man, I got to figure out how to make this stupid thing work properly. It's really easy to accidentally open up ports that have just an existing NAT that's just 8 years old, and you're just like, oh man, what is happening right now? And if you aren't looking for these detections, if you aren't protecting those servers, you aren't reviewing where access exists, it's really, really easy for an attacker to just start hitting that server and find a cred that's able to get in. The amount of authentications are insane that will hit your server the moment that it hits the internet. Will be found quickly and it will be authenticated very quickly if they can get to it. So put it behind anything you can, shut off cache credentials if you can, hide your RDP servers if you can, and anything that can move laterally. Like RDP always has that risk just generally, but from the internet is always the most important.
Yeah, that's solid advice, Matt. Thanks for that. And then you had talked earlier about VPN servers being an attack vector. Can you just refresh my memory as to what were some recent attacks where the VPN server was an attack vector?
Sure. I'm happy to. What we're seeing most common these days, and I had mentioned this previously, is end-of-life VPNs that are sitting on the internet and organizations forget about them. It's really, really easy to forget about your SonicWall VPN at Office 3 that you just put there like 8 years ago, and you have like 3 staff that use it, and you're just kind of like, it's just a thing that's listening on the internet. but you just forget about it because you have a million other things to do, and you probably aren't even on SonicWall anymore. Maybe you're on FortiGate and you're just like, I hate that thing. It's just there, whatever. But SonicWall end of life that stuff years ago, and there are multiple RCEs to break into those and pretty much get full access into any network, generally speaking. There are literally hundreds of thousands of SonicWalls on the internet that are just, if not owned already, will be owned with only a matter of time. So it's really important to ensure that not only are you doing that, but you're also watching what your VPN providers are pushing down and you're patching quickly. Because when you see a VPN provider say like, oh, we have an RCE and we're releasing an emergency patch, you really need to be applying that as fast as you can these days, because an attacker is going to pick that up really quickly. All they really need to do is diff the two versions, tear them apart, and determine what was changed. Someone will create an exploit in most cases these days, because the value, like as Scott was saying, the bounty's gone up. So if you're talking about like 300 grand per each box that you were able to successfully own, that's significant value to sit down and try to generate an exploit, which means that people that write exploits have a lot of value in generating those exploits and selling the exploits to these people. So it is a large business at this point, and it has its own flywheel that's running of, we know there's an RCE, a company patched an RCE, we're going to find that RCE, we're going to sell it to the people that are going to be launching ransomware, or they'll keep it, they'll get access and sell the access, which is another path that happens on the VPN side. So you really need to ensure that you are updating them, remove any deprecated, and updating them to a new version or new model if you need to. But probably just concentrate your VPNs if you have that many VPNs just sitting around. And of course, stay on top of what your VPNs are releasing, because they release it often. I think Pulse Secure, FortiGate, and Palo Alto all had RCEs in the last year that really had to be patched almost immediately. And I'm sure I'm forgetting some off the top of my head. So it's crazy, honestly.
Yeah, and forgive my ignorance here, but when you have a VPN and you're with a VPN provider, are they just like constantly emailing you saying, you know, this is an update, you need to patch this? Like how, and if they do, how do you keep track of what is really important and what isn't?
Vendors are going to vary on how they communicate that to their constituents. Again, you know, I have a fairly significant background in Cisco. You could subscribe to those, right? But if you didn't go out to the support website and subscribe to it, if Cisco didn't call you up by name and say FYI, you know, the number of times I would go out to a customer and they would be proud of how long their ASA had been running.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, that's awesome. But that means you never patched it. Right? And that ASA is under sale. Problems there. So yeah, it's a burden. And I think the other thing we're seeing, and it kind of goes into the conversations we had about RDP, is as we now, because of the pandemic, have had to change how we work. VPNs used to be 3 or 4 people in the business. Now it's everyone. That's overwhelming some of the firewall services, but more importantly, it's really calling into question, what should a VPN be there for? Well, I want always on so that I know that they're secure and they're going through my security stack. That's fantastic. So everyone is VPNing through their Hulu and their Netflix. That's no good. Okay, well, I'll do the split tunnel. Well, great. Then the other part of the tunnel's unprotected and is a wide open space to get in to that host and bring malware into it. And then when you VPN in, you just continue to share that around the rest of the org. And then do I need to have myself go to corporate, so then corporate can kick me to M365, GCP, AWS. So technologies like SD-WAN, architectures like SASE, the integration more and more of MFA, I think are reshaping what VPN looks like. So it is both secure your VPN servers, but also reconsider your VPN strategy. Take a step back and go, is this right for my business? Am I protected well? And then again, bringing it back to why we are all here theoretically, the Blumira piece is great in that it's going to look around the entirety of the organization. So while I'm figuring that stuff out, it's going to go, well, while you figured it out, you took a little longer than you should have. And we found this little thing, and this little thing's bad. And this is how you should fix the little thing. So if you really look at VPN with a different set of glasses, I think that there's a chance to really reduce your threat landscape.
Yeah, reducing attack surface is always the best way to make yourself more secure, for sure, 100%.
And Matt, you had talked about this a little earlier, how, we really at Blumira, we encourage all of our customers to enable Sysmon. Scott, from your experience, is that something that your small to medium-sized businesses, your clients are enabling in their environments, or are they aware of Sysmon?
So I think that the awareness is emerging, but not top of mind. I think it's a really, really good point. I know pre-pandemic, the majority of the conversations I was having with customers was around visibility, right? I have my M&M, I have my crunchy outside, it's a little gushy in the middle, but I got my perimeter defenses stood up. I don't know what's going on east, west. And now that people have somewhat settled into our, call it next normal, those conversations are being revisited. And Sysmon gives that ability. It's another data source of what's going on in my environment. It's a pretty good breadcrumb trail of what's happened in the environment. So yeah, I think the more visibility, the better. And I think our customers are coming to awareness of that as well. Mm-hmm. We had a customer who asked for assistance during an internal threat. And they didn't have any real way to kind of see what was going on. And as we dug into it, good people, there was only 13 people in the company. There was 15 Active Directory entries. Of the 50 Active Directory entries, 10 were enabled to be protected by MFA, but only 3 of those were enforced. So their attempts to secure weren't really fully functional, and not having something like Sysmon made it much more difficult for us to be authoritative about the behaviors of a bad contractor who wasn't particularly happy with the negotiations going on with that particular entity.
And Matt, you were saying earlier how when you have Sysmon enabled, you can generally see ransomware behaviors far earlier than even like an EDR would see them, those indicators of compromise. Why is that?
So by default, Windows doesn't log out very much. You can ask it to log out more. Like if you have a file server, you can ask it to audit file shares. There's a number of things it can do. And if you're really good at Windows, you can set up like SACLs, which are like special ACLs associated with detection, which if you look at our Hive Nightmare stuff, you'll see some discussions around how to set SACLs on your Hive files. So if someone tries to access your shadow copies, you would get detected on it. However, what none of these really do, and what Windows doesn't do, is give you real visibility into the processes within your machines, what's actually being touched and how those network connections are happening within that environment. You can get some from 5156 and 5155 and that kind of series from auditing your network connections, but nowhere near what Sysmon can. And Sysmon is useful from 2 perspectives. It's useful to the extent that you will be able to see markers of threats in your environment. There are only so many ways to attack a machine. It is not magic as much as some attackers would like to claim it is some magical thing they've created. It can really only happen a few different ways. And Sysmon gives you Sysmon and PowerShell transcription and command line logging will give you enough visibility to detect essentially any threat that's getting dropped onto an environment, because it will give you broad process and memory visibility. And most importantly, exactly what Scott was just saying, it will also allow you to look back, which is one of the most important parts. Is when you're starting to go through any sort of breach or any sort of investigation, if you don't have this information, you will have no idea if a process was executed. It will be literally impossible without really deep forensic work to determine what has happened. And Sysmon gives you that level of visibility across your entire environment, depending on how you configure it. We recommend 2 different Sysmon configurations generally. Swift on Security has one. It's another one called Sysmon Modular. There's a really cool part about Sysmon Modular is that it archives every single potentially bad file into a backup on that machine itself. So if you ever have to go back, you can go back and look. And it's free. And Sysmon for Linux is coming out soon. So there is a really broad and interesting move forward with Sysmon that Microsoft has decided to push off into this additional service, which is okay. But it's really, really important to use from a visibility perspective. And if you have a SIM, if you use Blumira, then by all means, just turn it on and set it up because we aren't going to charge you for the extra data. But if you use a SIM that does charge on that, it is important for you to consider that it will increase your data volume. It does increase kind of how that data is being used because you're going to see more, which will increase how your data is being just used and how you're passing it. But it is invaluable. It will allow you to detect before an EDR does. And it'll allow you to do kind of the things that you heard me saying before, which is to say, if someone is exfiltrating your data and they're using rclone, which is almost the only tool they use for exfiltration at this point, things like Sysmon will let you see that rclone is being dropped, rclone is being executed. Here is the command line it executed with. It's going now. And those are the kind of areas that you really need to have visibility into your environments, not only because of ransomware, but also because of any sort of internal threat to your environment as well.
Yeah, those are all really good points, Matt. And it seems like that, I launched a poll asking if our attendees had Sysmon enabled. 67% did, 33% do not. If you're one of the folks that don't have Sysmon enabled, you're curious about how to get that up and running, we have a great guide on Blumira's blog on how to enable Sysmon that Amanda Berlin wrote, very comprehensive and really easy to follow along with. So I dropped that in the chat box, so feel free to check that out when you get the chance. So let's go on to honeypots. Anyone feel free to, or Matt or Scott, feel free to give us a quick explanation to those who may not know what a honeypot is or how that works.
I mean, I can offer my layman's perspective and then I'll let Matt go deeper, but I mean, it's completely off topic, but Amazon package thefts is something, at least in my neighborhood, is that the pocket next door, right? And a honeypot is nothing more than a fake package that when they open it up, it's got a GPS tracker or some blue explosive dye that makes the people happy. I'm putting up something that looks valid, but isn't, and then allows me to work within it and track it. And having that is really powerful as kind of a fake front door to see what's going on. Are people interested in you? If they are, what are they trying to do? Have they figured out you have an ASA that hasn't been patched and they're trying to get it that way? So I think honeypots are great. Most of my customers, if they do them, it's as a hobby. It's not necessarily, form and function of their day-to-day operations. So Matt, maybe take us down the rabbit hole a little bit deeper, and then maybe you should talk about what you guys can do.
Sure, yeah. So honeypots were one of those things that were really popular in early security. Like early 2000s, late 90s, people were like, this is great. We're going to put up fake servers and we'll just know. And then they fell off. I don't know why, but they fell off. There was the people were blackballing connections that hit honeypots, and there was a whole kind of industry growing around it, and they fell off. And my assumption is that it was just too much. There was just the additional complexity of networks. There's so much to do. The addition of like, great, I have another thing to manage. I'm going to just not do that. It was just too much. So what we see from honeypots, and I want to kind of clear up a few parts about honeypots, is what we often hear of honeypots is, well, the attackers will know. They'll know, so they're just not going to touch it, and then they'll be able to get around it. The issue with that is that you still have to touch something to figure out what something is. You can't just divine what a machine is without touching it. And you can make it enticing, of course, add a file server, make it look like a disk server, make it look like an ASA. It doesn't really matter what you're doing with it. But either way, someone is going to have to touch it to evaluate if they want to get deeper into it. So with honeypots, you really get, and the way that Blumira approaches this, you get multiple levels of interest associated with the honeypot, and it allows you to have multiple levels of detection associated with it as well. For Blumira, we include honeypots as a part of our sensor platform. So any sensor that gets dropped can also be a honeypot. And that immediately gives you what we generally call internally as a high fidelity detection. You know someone touched it, you know how they touched it, and you can determine behavior based on that, which is to say, if someone scans it with Nmap, you can make some assumptions as to who's doing that, unless that company for some reason uses Nmap. Whereas if someone is scanning it from Nessus or OpenBAS or a known vol scanning server that they have internally, you can make some assumptions on that as well. However, if someone is trying to actually authenticate into that over SMB or authenticate into it over FTP, and they're making multiple attempts to get into this honeypot, you know that there's an actual attacker that is attempting from a very specific IP to get into your honeypot, and you have a persistent insider or you have a persistent attacker in your environment trying to do something to determine data within it. It becomes a really strong detection point for all environments to determine where do I have risk and where is that risk coming from. There are a few other ways to do that internally, like looking at behaviors in your internal network if you segment heavily or if you look at S-flow data. But the easiest way to do it is to just drop honeypots in your area inside of your broadcast. Let's say you don't know a lot of segment. You could drop them in your broadcast, and you're still going to see that kind of detection that you need and really want to have inside of your environment. And if you have really good segmentation, hey, why not? You should just drop them everywhere because it's fun. There are a few other areas that are really interesting for us that I always recommend people look at. The Blumira honeypot is near and dear to my heart, obviously, and I recommend reaching out and learning more about it. There are also honey tokens. Canary has a good, they're called Canary tokens that are free for people. We also have, for those of you who use Blumira, and you are also welcome to look at it, we also have something up on our GitHub for determining Kerber roasting using honey tokens, which is really one of the only ways to detect Kerber roasting really well, is to basically taint your AD environment, so people will Kerber roast that, and which is basically stealing from your Azure ADFS. Using honey drives and we use Open Canary on and off here internally, but any sort of open source honeypots, there are a number of them, are also very good. What you really want to make sure is that it's outputting data in a way that you can use in your SIM or any sort of detection environment you have, because you don't want to not have visibility if you're going to go through the effort to drop this in. And here at Blumira, we of course developed detections around it, but you could do very similar internally for free with Canary tokens and dropping them around your environment as well.
Right, and I think there's that caveat there that the open source route might be a little bit more challenging for the smaller IT and security teams to set up and maintain, right? Which is why the Blumira honeypots, just being able to deploy those with the click of a button is appealing.
Yeah, deploy, curate, and then interpret. Those three things is what native in the Blumira platform, and otherwise would be a manual task by the user. So yeah, it's a huge benefit in my opinion.
Exactly.
So deploy honeypots.
Great.
All right, so moving on to our
Most fun one.
tip of the day, maintaining backups. So I'm launching a survey now. I'm curious as to, whether our attendees here have those offsite backups, whether they test them or not. And either Matt or Scott, want to talk to the importance of having both offsite backups and also testing those regularly?
Yeah, I'll start again, and then I'll let Matt take us down. One of the things that I did at Cisco and I'm doing at Cerium is trying to help our customers and our employees understand that security is a thing, but it's much more powerful when it's an adverb, right? Secure collab, secure wireless is much more interesting than a firewall. And so within that construct, what's been interesting is in the last couple of quarters, I'm hearing much more conversation around cyber recovery. How do I bring that data back if in fact everything else has failed? And so we are looking at, is it truly immutable? Do you have multiple copies, to your point? Are you pulling both from your on-premise and your cloud environments and making sure that you're looking at that? Do you have mechanics to look at the data at rest so that if you have a long tail exploit kit, okay, I got ransomed, I'm going to rebuild the server again. Well, that ransomware is still there. It's still sitting there waiting to start scanning again and refire. So those things are critical. And then sadly, I live in the West Coast. we have the threat of a 9.0 earthquake. We have already had one good volcano go, and then the world's on fire. So if you don't have your backups geographically disparate from where you're at, your backup means nothing if it falls into the ocean as Seattle does when the 9.0 hits. So from a business continuity standpoint, you need to have that. It needs to be immutable. You need to be looking at it while it's at rest, and then it needs to be geographically separated into a completely different environmental area so that one event doesn't present a conflict in your ability to retrieve it.
Those are all great tips. Looks like all of our participants in the poll have offsite backups and test them regularly, which is great to hear.
That is great.
And Matt, earlier you were talking about the point of tainted backups, trying to restore from a tainted backup scenario. Can you talk a little about that and how you can prevent having tainted backups backing up from a clean copy?
Yeah, it's really one of the biggest issues with backups after an incident is knowing when it started. And I mean, this is going to go back to the visibility component, honestly. It happens all the time. It might seem like it doesn't happen all the time, and people, I mean, it goes back to an early session of it just doesn't get talked about a lot. But it is really common that an organization will get owned. They'll get owned months before the actual actor will move on that. They will just get owned and they'll leave a back door in, usually Cobalt Strike, because it always is. And they will sit there and they'll wait. And they might start 2 months later. But if you only have backups for a month, or you're just doing differential backups and you have last week's or you have last night's, and you're just going to say, well, we have that one, it's only going to introduce that again. However, I think all of us then think, well, 2 months. 2 months is a long time. That data has changed. Things are different. There is a massive delta between those two backups at that point. So you in either case, you're in a situation where visibility and being able to detect early is paramount to your environment, because your recovery effort can happen at the very least if you have, let's say, 2.5-month-old backups, but you're still going to have to spin up that new one. You're still going to have to spin it up off a network, and you're still going to have to try to reap information off of it to bring your other backup up to time. And that is if you want to think about like mean time to recovery and that kind of thing, it's going to stretch that out significantly. So they need to be off-site. If you can store historicals, do. It doesn't need to be forever, but you should store some amount of historicals through that. Scott brings up a really good point of having multi-regional backups is really, really important as well. It's cloud providers go down, things fail. I mean, it is the inevitability of the world at this point that infrastructure is complex, and sometimes things just go wrong. So it's really important to have them stored multiple places, have some amount of historicals, have a plan in place if you need to pull up your data from an old backup and how you can reconcile it. And if you are in a situation where you really only have recent, which is okay, you need to be ready to perform incident response, cleanup, and probably rebuild that environment using some data from that existing backup instead of trying to clean it up and bring it up. It is a real dangerous game to take a tainted backup and try to clean it up enough that it's safe again, especially if persistence has gotten landed anywhere in that machine. Could you do it? Sure. Would anyone recommend doing it? It would be hard pressed to find someone to recommend doing that over saying just build a new DC and we'll just copy over the information, because it's the safer way to go about it at that point. But either way, you still need to have backups, and those backups can't be encrypted. So they need to be immutable. They need to be somewhere else. They cannot be in the environment. If there's somewhere where BitLocker can touch, or somewhere that someone can run a PS exec and just touch them, they will be encrypted and they will be gone. So it's really, really important to do that. And the other area that doesn't get spoke about a lot is ensuring that your vSphere environment is also well protected. So those backups and your HA backups are also not going to either get tainted, deleted, or encrypted, or however someone may attack your vSphere and VDI virtualization environment. It's really, really important to also kind of validate that your virtual environment is just as secure and just as protected as your general infrastructure, as well as your cloud infrastructure as well.
Those are all great tips. Thank you so much for going over that, Matt. Looks like we have gone over all of the 5 best practices that we've come up with. And I just want to talk briefly about, Matt, earlier you talked about the stages of a ransomware attack and how important it is to really find those indicators of compromise in the first couple of stages, because once it gets beyond that, it gets a lot harder to stop that ransomware attack from happening. Can you talk specifically about how Blumira detects those early indicators of compromise?
Sure, yeah. So when we say scanning, when Blumira says scanning, when you hear me say scanning, I almost always mean scanning internally. Scanning from the internet is noise. You are being scanned from the internet this moment. You will never stop it. It will not stop. I do not care how hard you try. You're never going to stop it. Blumira provides block lists that use threat feeds, depending on your NGFW, that will help you stop some of that scanning, but it's never going to stop. It just don't try. It's probably the best way to put it. Make sure your attack surface is clean is what you should be doing, not trying to stop scanning. However, the moment that someone starts and gets that foothold in your environment, they need to discover where they are. They need to discover what's happening in that environment, and they need to move. Because they can't stay where they are. It's not going to get them any benefit to stay on your HR person's machine that they're able to phish. They need to move, and they need to do more. I should say, unless they can run Mimikatz and get a DA credential, then they can move really fast. However, let's assume they still need to go somewhere. And in either case, when they get to your DC, they're still going to do the step. They need to determine where they are in the environment, because they need to know what they're going to encrypt. You can't attack an environment if you don't know the environment. So what's always going to happen in every single case is that they are going to scan your environment internally to determine what needs to happen. They're going to look for lateral movement, so 445 and 3389 specifically, and they're going to look for web servers as well internally. How Blumira approaches this is a few different ways. We look for lateral traffic internally, so internal to internal, that is over ports that are known for lateral movement. And we look for an IP that's trying to connect to over 10 other IPs in a certain time frame. That's how we approach that detection. And the reason that we do it that way is because so many different technologies can give you that answer. Windows Firewall can give you that answer. Sysmon can give you that answer. Windows 5156 audit logs can give you that answer. Potentially switch logs give you that answer, and good segmentation will also give you that answer as well. So you have this broad set of data that can tell you, and a honeypot will also tell you this for that matter. It's really important to be able to get that level of visibility, because then you know at the beginning, someone is in my environment, someone is scanning from HR person A's computer, and they're attempting to figure out what's happening in the environment. It's really easy to quarantine one machine than it is to quarantine all of your machines and act quickly on that. So when we say scanning, I'm largely talking about an attacker who's been able to start and wants to actually move that foothold beyond that initial attack. You can, of course, do scanning from the internet. There are a number of threat feeds out there that are good for that, for known scanning machines. It will be loud and you will turn it off. I can guarantee it. But you can try. I mean, I always recommend trying.
And then what about gaining a foothold? I mean, what are some things that Blumira does specifically to detect that sort of behavior?
Yeah, so gaining a foothold is always interesting because it requires someone to be able to land somewhere and move. So when we talk about gaining a foothold, it can vary. It could be brute forcing, although brute forcing I don't love as a pattern. And it is relevant, but I don't love it as a pattern because people accidentally brute force themselves constantly. It is like, if you look at your failed logins, I guarantee you will find something that matches the pattern of brute forcing in a day of looking at the most. However, password spraying is the most common pattern for attackers, where, because a brute force is always going to result in a lockout, unless you have no lockout policy, which is a different discussion entirely, and something you should look at if you don't have that. However, password spraying allows them to stay under that lockout. It allows them to try a lot of different passwords. And if anyone in your environment has been part of a breach, if you don't have a good password rotation policy, If you use passwords that we're coming up on autumn 2021 exclamation point for everyone as the next new password that will be used for password spraying. Those kind of passwords are really easy for attackers to come up with, or if they just do a little bit of OSINT in your environment, like Blumira is from Michigan, it would be really easy for an attacker to say, I'm going to create a word list. Detroit Tigers, Lions, I'm going to build a word list, I'm going to spray it against this environment, and only try once or twice against every user. And password spraying is incredibly successful if you know MFA exists in an environment, because people are predictable, just generally speaking. Passwords are just inherently insecure. And stealing passwords tends to be associated with Mimikatz, allowing people to privilege escalate across an environment, which, as we've talked about a lot, is just too easy in Windows these days. So you should expect a dump of credentials to happen through stealing passwords. And going back to the earlier part of this conversation, Sysmon, EDR tools, things that are going to look inside of the memory utilization of your environment, how people are impacting your environment, are really, really important. You should be able to see when when Word triggers a command shell or a PowerShell command. That should be possible for you. And if it's not currently possible, you are at risk for any kind of attack that could potentially result in foothold from a malware or living off the land binary perspective. So you really need to get that level of visibility in. And password spraying and brute forcing is really more about getting those logs in and evaluating those logs. You really, really need to have access logs to determine those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's great advice, Matt, once again. And I know we're almost running out of time here, so I just want to talk briefly about, Scott, when you had, we have a Blumira trial, 30 days, really easy to get up and running and deploy that. Scott, what was your experience with running a Blumira trial?
Surprising, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I remember the very first one, there's marketing language of, we'll have you up in hours. You're like, okay, that's cute. We went to an organization and we had seven different technical controls that were configured and populating Blumira within 1 hour, right? Internally, when we rolled it out in our own shop, similar behaviors and immediate, well, that's interesting kind of things. So it really, truly is easy to do. You throw out a sensor, you didn't make a couple of command line changes to the desktops, and you're starting to see same things very, very quickly. I haven't been around a product that was easier.
Excellent. Well, we love to hear that feedback. Thanks so much for that. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about Cerium and what you guys do and how you can help?
Yeah, I mean, we're a Northwest-based company. We really try to be experts in what we support and sell. We're not firewalls are us. We pick our vendors carefully. If it's a situation where you need assistance with advisory services, I want vulnerability pen tests, I want you to come in and evaluate me on a GRC basis. We do that. We certainly provide a very robust set of technical controls that's going to give you some of the stuff that feeds into the Blumira. And then we are working with Blumira to deliver this as a managed service so that, you can sleep on the weekends, because we have 24/7 people. I have an office of our people sitting in the Philippines. So we have follow the sun. But if you're looking at that secure, collab, secure network idea and a partner who enables that, that's really how we go to market. We don't want to just sell you a box. We want to make sure that we're getting the business outcomes for you that you need, delivering it with great excellence. And we do that by being the very highest level of certification in any vendor we represent. So if we can help you, we'd love to take your call and see if it's a fit.
Awesome. And if you want to contact either Blumira or Cerium, just feel free to vote in the poll that I've just deployed now. And thank you so much for joining us, Scott. It's been a pleasure. We've really enjoyed having you on and really enjoyed having Cerium as a partner in general. You guys have been awesome. So thank you so much. And Matt, thank you as always for sharing your expertise here. I know that I'm sure you've helped a lot of people listening in on this live stream. So thanks again.
Yeah, happy to help.
Thank you, everyone, for contributing the time today.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for joining. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Have a good day, everyone.